However, by the 5th week, we were tearing our hair out, and the joy of the inquiry had dissipated somewhat. And so part of what sparked my interest in trying to develop this talk was when I thought back on this institute, how can I capture some of the frustration? Because I think that some of the frustration that you can see pictured here, these are not the actual participants, in case you were wondering, but they do represent the sense of frustration and even factionalism within the group, which I think maps on somewhat to some of the conflicts and concerns that many scholars have and many activists have about human rights. And I'm just going to, as with many of my points tonight, in the interest of brevity, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, and then I'm happy to elaborate or answer questions later on. But where we broke down, where the factions sort of formed, were primarily in these 3 areas. And there was sort of the idealists and the pessimists. I'll let you guess where I was. But the issues were effectiveness. For many participants, there was the feeling that the Human Rights Project is too idealistic. It sounds great as sort of a set of aspirations, but if we really want to solve real human problems, we need an agenda that's less idealistic than a lot of the highfalutin language that's connected with human rights. A lot of us were concerned about the issue of power and inequality, that there was a sense that the Human Rights Project wasn't really touching the deep roots of human suffering in the world, which had to do with global structures of inequality, in particular in the economy and the global economy. And many of my colleagues really felt that the critique of capitalism that was really fundamental to their worldview was much more salient, and that human rights was perhaps even a distraction from that. And then finally, and this is more in the area of what I'll be focusing on in the rest of my talk, that really challenging the notion of universality. Think about the phrase human rights. It has a notion of universality built into it. We're not talking about civil rights, we're not talking about national rights, we're talking about human rights. So the central idea here is that there is something universal that applies to all humans. Well, many of my colleagues, and indeed many anthropologists, really question this. Is it really possible to have a universal set of rights that applies to all people without, in some way, imposing views on people, in some way imposing perhaps on cultural integrity? And I'll say a little bit more about that. But these were the main areas of conflict. So in the rest of this talk, I want to get a little bit more deeply into this issue, this sort of juxtaposition of culture and universality. And I'll sort of begin by suggesting to you that there is an impasse, especially from the perspective of anthropology, but then suggest some ways perhaps to see beyond that impasse. I'll touch briefly on the history of the Human Rights Project, although my historical references are more implicit, and I can elaborate on them more at the end. And I want to spend some time mapping out at least some of the critiques that are out there about human rights, because I think that for those of us who care about human rights and consider ourselves proponents of human rights, it is nonetheless really important to understand how and why people are critiquing them. And I think in the long run, it will make the Human Rights Project more effective if we can do that. And then what I'm going to do, and I hope I can do this in a clear way, is to sort of explain how anthropology contributes to the critique of the Human Rights Project, but then also how it, I think, points to some ways to strengthen that project. And I'm going to take a chance at the very end and try to talk a little bit about my research on gender and violence in Senegal, West Africa, and show you a little bit of my data, and hopefully illustrate effectively where I think anthropology can take us in a positive direction in thinking about human rights. Let's see. That's Eleanor Roosevelt, in case you're wondering who that is, holding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we talk about the Human Rights Project, we're talking about primarily a set of covenants, treaties, laws that were developed and enacted in the beginning in the immediate post-World War II period and being elaborated upon in the decades following. We can certainly trace some of the roots of human rights to the period before World War II. For example, the development of the League of Nations and some of the international law that the League of Nations tried to promulgate. If you look at international law, particularly in the 1920s, that addressed the issue of slavery and trying to curtail and put an end to slavery. But really it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II, sort of you can see the concentration camps being evoked there. There was this sense that and it's hard to sum up the set of realizations that came at the end of World War II, but this sense of horror at what human beings were capable of doing, and this urge to use law and international consensus as a way to somehow redress that. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt was very key in developing and popularizing, was really a key turning point. There are other turning points too, certainly the Nuremberg trials, but in the establishment of the United Nations, there was an effort to say we're going to try to steer a new course, and we're going to use international law and we're going to use international consensus to do this. And indeed, if you read some of the language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is quite poetic and quite beautiful and quite visionary and quite inspiring in this vein.